After arriving in Holland in September 1783, John Locke settled in Amsterdam. This was a logical choice. Amsterdam was a center for disaffected English radicals, and Locke joined this underground community. The exiled radicals had not lost their revolutionary fervor. They pinned their hopes on two leaders, the Duke of Monmouth and the Earl of Argyll, a Scottish fugitive. The plan was for Monmouth to invade England and raise an army in the rebellious West Country. At the same time, Argyll would raise a Scottish army. As we shall see, when these plans came to fruition in 1685, the result was a disaster called Monmouth's Rebellion. While exiles were plotting revolution in Holland, things were going well for King Charles in England. The Whig party had been thoroughly routed, and Charles, ruling without Parliament, went about consolidating his power. His spies infiltrated radical groups in Holland and reported to the Crown. The name John Locke appears many times in these reports. In February 1685, Charles II died, having converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. His brother and successor James II had professed Catholicism for many years. The nightmare of radical Whigs was now a reality. A devout Catholic governed Protestant England. A king who admired the absolutism of Louis XIV. A king who had revenue sufficient to rule without calling Parliament. A king who faced virtually no domestic opposition. James II was a lucky man. No other Stuart king had ascended the throne with such bright prospects. But James did face one formidable opponent, himself. It took just a few years for James to squander his advantages. He even managed to alienate his conservative Tory and Anglican supporters. As one historian has said, it is the peculiar genius of James that in less than 4 years as sovereign, he completely undermined the confidence of the most loyal and subservient people faced by an English king in the 17th century. Charles II had been a shrewd, devious monarch who never let his religious beliefs interfere with the greater good, his power. These qualities served him well. James II, on the other hand, well, James was a pious man. After James had lost his throne and was staying in France, a French lady said of him,
"To tell the truth, our good King James is a brave and honest man, but the silliest I have ever seen in my life. A child of 7 would not make such crass mistakes as he does. Piety makes people outrageously stupid."
The piety of James did not hinder him from enjoying the company of ladies, who were often seen creeping up the back stairs of the palace. Much to the merriment of court observers, Catholic James preferred Protestant mistresses, and homely ones at that. His favorite, Catherine Sedley, was somewhat bemused by the devotion James showed her.
"It cannot be my beauty, because I haven't any. And it cannot be my wit, because he hasn't enough of it himself to know that I have any."
As we know, the radicals exiled in Holland were planning an insurrection led by the Duke of Monmouth in England and by the Earl of Argyll in Scotland. This uprising, Monmouth's Rebellion, occurred within a few months after James became king. On landing in western England, Monmouth circulated a declaration with a list of reforms: annual parliaments, no standing army, repeal of all laws against Protestant dissenters, restoration of town charters, elective sheriffs, free juries, and independent judges. King James, according to this declaration, was a tyrant. He had poisoned his brother Charles and should be tried for the crime. Monmouth's rebellion failed miserably. In Scotland, Argyll did little more than get himself hunted down and executed. In England, Monmouth fared better. He managed to raise an army in England's traditionally rebellious West Country, only to see it decimated in the Battle of Sedgemoor. Upon seeing the battle was lost, the gallant Monmouth stripped off his armor, borrowed money from a faithful follower, and proceeded to show that his fame as a jockey was well-deserved. Monmouth galloped from the field of battle, leaving his men to be slaughtered. Monmouth was captured and taken to London, where he groveled before King James, his uncle, pleading for mercy. The 19th century historian Thomas Macaulay wrote a vivid account of this meeting.
Monmouth threw himself on the ground and crawled to the king's feet. He wept. He tried to embrace his uncle's knees with his pinioned arms. He begged for life, only life, at any price. He owned that he had been guilty of a great crime, but tried to throw the blame on others, particularly on Argyle. The poor terrified duke vowed that he had never wished to take the crown, but had been led into that fatal error by others. As to the declaration, he had not written it, he had not read it, he had signed it without looking at it. It was all the work of Ferguson, that bloody villain Ferguson. "Do you expect me to believe," said James, with contempt but too well merited, "that you set your hand to a paper of such moment without knowing what it contained?" "Is there then no hope?" asked Monmouth. James turned away in silence.
The charismatic Duke of Monmouth, the great hope of radical Whigs for Protestant England, soon found himself on the executioner's block. There, his luck turned from bad to worse. An incompetent executioner required over 5 blows with his axe to finish the job. After disposing of Monmouth, King James decided to teach the West Country rebels a lesson they would never forget. The instrument of his vengeance was the infamous Judge Jeffreys, perhaps the most notorious judge in all of English history. Accompanied by 4 other judges, Jeffreys traveled to the West Country to punish those who had assisted Monmouth's rebellion. Jeffreys made no pretense of impartiality. This outburst during one trial is typical.
"I will tell you, there is not one of those lying, sniveling, canting Presbyterians, but one way or another had a hand in the rebellion. Presbytery has all manner of villainy in it."
Jeffreys enjoyed his work. He laughed, shouted, joked, and swore. He sentenced hundreds of prisoners to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their dismembered bodies were displayed throughout the West Country, along roads, in marketplaces, on village greens, on gates, over doorways. This gruesome episode, known as the Bloody Assizes, was seared into the memory of West Country farmers. Later generations recalled its terrors over their cider and Christmas fires. Even in the 19th century, some peasants refused, after sunset, to pass by spots where dismembered bodies had been hung 2 centuries earlier. As information about the failed revolution filtered into Holland, the exiled radicals became despondent. Their cause had disintegrated, and they had lost many friends. John Locke was in hiding when he heard the bad news. There was a warrant out for his arrest for complicity in the Rye House plot, and the English government was seeking his extradition. Now, Locke faced the prospect of being implicated in Monmouth's rebellion. Eventually, Locke became bolder and began to move about the streets of Amsterdam under an assumed name, Dr. van der Linden. When he learned he would not be extradited, Locke dropped the false name, but remained cautious. In the wake of Monmouth's rebellion, the radical exiles continued to meet and plan, but they were disheartened. Fortunately for them, King James soon embarked on a series of politically inept moves that would cost him his throne in 1688. For James, the crushing of Monmouth's rebellion was a catalyst. It filled him with confidence to forge ahead with his plans for England, plans that included securing Catholics in positions of high authority. Basking in the glow of a crushed rebellion, James demanded several things from his loyal Parliament. He wanted funds to maintain and expand the army that had put down the rebellion. He wanted to staff this standing army with Catholic officers, and he wanted to relax the laws against Protestant nonconformists and Catholics. Parliament winced at these demands. A standing army, a professional army, maintained in peacetime, revived uneasy memories of Oliver Cromwell's military rule, and it smacked of French despotism. An army populated with Catholic officers was even worse. a convenient tool in James's grand design to Catholicize England. Few members of this Tory Parliament favored religious toleration. Even nonconformists who stood to gain from toleration were suspicious. James posed as a champion of religious freedom, but years earlier he had ferociously persecuted Scottish Presbyterians. Was James pushing for toleration so he could appoint fellow Catholics to positions of power? Many Englishmen thought so. Parliament balked, and James fumed. He dissolved Parliament in 11 days and never called another. Like Charles II, during the final years of his reign, James II had all the money he needed, and so could rule without further grants from Parliament. James used his prerogative powers as king to bring about the changes he wanted. He voided laws against Catholics and nonconformists. When 7 Anglican bishops refused to read a royal proclamation, James imprisoned them. As a result, conservative Anglicans, longtime supporters of absolute obedience, began to rethink their theories of resistance. It didn't take long for James to alienate just about everyone, Whig and Tory alike. He had only one advantage left. He had not fathered a male heir to the throne. James was in his 50s, old by 17th century standards. His critics believed they could tolerate a few more years of this pious Catholic ruler because, after his death, the throne would descend to his Protestant daughter, Mary, the wife of Holland's ruler, William of Orange. While traveling in the West Country, James prayed for a son at the miraculous well of St. Winifred. Unfortunately for James, his prayer was answered. His Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, and there was no doubt the boy would be raised a Catholic. Now, England faced a line of Catholic monarchs. For opponents of James, this was the last straw. Tories and Whigs conspired with Holland's William of Orange to launch an invasion of England. William and his army invaded in 1688, their ships carried by a favorable Protestant wind. The army of James, 20,000 strong, was larger than that of William, but the two armies never fought each other. Many high-ranking English officers deserted to William. James vacillated, panicked, and fled. This remarkable invasion, the Glorious Revolution, involved very little bloodshed. It was only the second successful invasion of England in 600 years, and she would never see another. It was now safe for John Locke to go home. He returned to England in February 1689 after 6 years in exile. Lady Massam wrote,
He continued for more than 2 years after the Revolution much in London, enjoying no doubt all the pleasure there that anyone can find, who, after having been long in a manner banished from his country, unexpectedly returning to it, sees himself more generally esteemed and respected than ever before.
Locke was offered a government position, but he refused.
I find you are all anxious to know what public office I mean to ask for. I can tell you in a word, none. On the score of my health, I have declined an appointment, which I should certainly have been glad to accept if I were younger and stronger than I am. I want nothing now but rest. It would never do for a man who is falling to pieces and fit only to close his account with life to rush into a great and new undertaking. Yet, though I decline to take any public work, I find myself so occupied with public affairs and the concerns of my friends that I am hardly able to touch a book now. I hope I shall be able one day to return to my old and agreeable ease in the world of letters.
When Locke published 2 treatises of government late in 1689, it appeared without his name. Throughout his remaining years, Locke frantically tried to keep his authorship secret. He destroyed all drafts and erased all recognizable references to the book in his correspondence. He implored friends who knew his authorship to hold their tongues. He dealt with his printer through a third party, even though the printer was a friend. and lest a browser in Locke's personal library should find it catalogued under his name, Locke catalogued and shelved 2 treatises of government under Anonymous. Were it not for a remark Locke makes in a codicil to his will, we wouldn't have any direct evidence of his authorship. The 2 Treatises of Government was written as a single discourse, but it was published in 2 parts. Its title page reads, 2 Treatises of Government. In the former, the false principles and foundation of Sir Robert Filmer and his followers are detected and overthrown. The latter is an essay concerning the true, original, extent, and end of civil government. Thus, the first treatise is a refutation of Sir Robert Filmer's defense of absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings. This is essentially a period piece, and was rarely reprinted or read after the 17th century. The second treatise, on the other hand, is a presentation of Locke's own political theory. This is the part which earned John Locke a place in the pantheon of great political thinkers. The target of the first treatise, Sir Robert Filmer, was a Kentish squire who died in 1653, years before Locke penned his response. As the exclusion crisis got underway in 1679, defenders of royal absolutism republished some of Filmer's writings in a single volume. Filmer had written his most famous work, Patriarchal, during the early 1640s, a time of bitter conflict between king and parliament, which resulted in civil war. Filmer, content to circulate manuscript copies of Patriarchal among the manor houses of Kent, chose not to publish this book. It was not published until 1680, 27 years after the author's death. In the first treatise, Locke calls Filmer's arguments glib nonsense. Why did this nonsense merit a refutation? Because, Locke explains, Filmer's works were influential.
I should not have writ against Sir Robert, or taken the pains to show his mistakes, inconsistencies, and want of what he so much boasts of and pretends wholly to build on, scripture proofs, were there not men amongst us who, by crying up his books and espousing his doctrine, save me from the reproach of writing against a dead adversary?
The arguments of Locke's dead adversary, Sir Robert Filmer, seem antiquated to the modern reader, but they were of great relevance to participants in the exclusion crisis when the power of the king was under attack. Filmer's arguments, as Locke asserts, were used to buttress the divine right of kings.
In this last age, a generation of men has sprung up among us who would flatter princes with an opinion that they have a divine right to absolute power, let the laws by which they are constituted and are to govern, and the conditions under which they enter upon their authority, be what they will.
In addition to Locke's first treatise, 2 other lengthy critiques of Filmer were written during the 1680s. James Tyrrell's Patriarcha non Monarcha, or The Patriarch Unmonarched, and Algernon Sidney's Discourses Concerning Government. James Tyrrell was a close friend of Locke for many years. Algernon Sidney, a radical who had fought against the king during the Civil War, was, like Locke, a member of Lord Shaftesbury's inner circle. Implicated in the Rye House plot, Sidney was executed in 1683. His critique of Filmer was introduced during his trial as evidence of his seditious tendencies. This is one reason John Locke worried that his as yet unpublished 2 treatises of government might land him in deep water. In the first treatise, Locke says he is not going to examine the history of patriarchal theory, only Robert Filmer's version of it. Patriarchalism had been used for some time to buttress the divine right of kings. In attacking Filmer, therefore, Locke was tackling a political tradition with impressive credentials. The word patriarch has several meanings. It can refer to the male head of a family, or to the male founder of a political society, or to early biblical personages like Adam and Noah, fathers of the human race. In England during the 16th and 17th centuries, these meanings of patriarch were blended into a theory of political obligation known as patriarchalism. In its most general sense, patriarchalism was a defense of monarchy grounded in the obedience which children owe to their father. The king was seen as father of his people, the supreme patriarch. As such, he commanded absolute obedience. Why? Because the fifth commandment demands children honor their parents. According to defenders of absolute monarchy, the fifth commandment also requires obedience to kings. A typical example is found in The King's Book, a summary of Anglican principles written in 1543. Referring to the fifth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, this book says,
By this commandment also subjects be bound not to withdraw their said fealty, truth, love, and obedience towards their princes for any cause whatsoever it be, nor do anything towards the hindrance or hurt thereof, nor of his estate.
The power of a king over his subjects is like the power of a father over his children. Before Filmer, defenders of patriarchalism often drew this analogy. But Filmer went further than his predecessors. For him, paternal power and kingly power are not merely similar, they are identical.
All power on earth is either derived or usurped from the fatherly power, there being no other original to be found of any power whatsoever.
Filmer uses the Bible to justify his theory, and he believes the Bible should be our primary guide in political theory. He summarizes his view of the biblical account in these words.
The first government in the world was monarchical, in the father of all flesh. Adam being commanded to multiply and people the earth, and to subdue it, and having dominion given him over all creatures, was thereby the monarch of the whole world. None of his posterity had any right to possess anything, but by his grant or permission, or by succession from him. The earth, saith the psalmist, hath he given to the children of men, which shows the title comes from fatherhood.
In the first treatise, Locke meets Filmer on his own ground, quoting extensively from the Bible. Again and again, Locke accuses Filmer of distorting the Bible to serve his own ends.
Sir Robert Filmer is able to warp the sacred rule of the Word of God, to make it comply with his present occasion. A way of proceeding not unusual to those who embrace not truths because reason and revelation offer them, but espouse tenets and parties for ends different from truth, and then resolve at any rate to defend them, and so do with the words and sense of authors they would fit to their purpose, just as Procrustes did with his guests, lop or stretch them as may best fit them to the size of their notions. And they always prove like those so served, deformed, lame, and useless.
According to Filmer, children are born in subjection to their parents, and this is the basis of absolute monarchy.
Every man that is born is so far from being freeborn, that by his very birth he becomes a subject to him that begets him, under which subjection he is always to live, unless by immediate appointment from God, or by the grant or death of his father, he become possessed of that power to which he was subject. The right of fatherly government was ordained by God for the preservation of mankind.
This, as Locke says, is the core of Filmer's argument.
Sir Robert Filmer's great position is this, that men are not naturally free. This is the foundation on which his absolute monarchy stands, and from which it erects itself to an height that its power is above every power, so high above all earthly and human things that thought can scarce reach it, that promises and oaths which tie the infinite deity cannot confine it.
Locke examines patriarchalism with meticulous care in the first treatise, and although patriarchalism is a theory long dead, a brief look at the first treatise will aid our understanding of Locke's own political theory in the second treatise. Locke identifies two strands in Filmer's patriarchalism. First, God granted Adam absolute dominion over the entire earth, and this grant, descending to Adam's heirs, was the foundation of absolute monarchy. Second, the monarch's right to rule derives from the father's absolute power of life and death over his children. Let's consider Locke's response to these assertions. According to Filmer, God vested Adam with an absolute dominion, a monarchical power over the earth and its inhabitants. The key text here is the first chapter of Genesis, verses 27 and 28.
So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth.
Did these words bestow upon Adam private dominion over the earth and its inhabitants, including other men? No, says Locke. Genesis conveys dominion over the irrational creatures, not over humans, who were created in the image of God. This grant of dominion was made not to Adam as an individual, but to the human species as a whole.
Whatever God gave by the words of this grant, it was not to Adam in particular, exclusive of all other men. Whatever dominion he had thereby, it was not private dominion, but a dominion in common with the rest of mankind. That this donation was not made in particular to Adam appears evidently from the words of the text, it being made to more than one. For it was spoken in the plural number. God blessed them, and said unto them, Have dominion.
Locke stresses how man's rationality sets him apart from other creatures.
God makes man in his own image, after his own likeness, makes him an intellectual creature, and so capable of dominion. For whereinsoever else the image of God consisteth, the intellectual nature was certainly a part of it, and belonged to the whole species, and enabled them to have dominion over the inferior creatures.
Locke is willing to debate the political implications of biblical passages, but he doesn't regard the Bible as a proper foundation for political philosophy. Man's right of dominion over the earth is justified, not by passages in Genesis, but by man's nature, especially the inclination for self-preservation.
I doubt not, but before these words were pronounced in Genesis 1:28 and 29, if they must be understood literally to have been spoken, and without any such verbal donation, man had a right to a use of the creatures by the will and grant of God. For the desire, strong desire of preserving his life and being, having been planted in him as a principle of action by God himself, reason, which was the voice of God in him, could not but teach and assure him that pursuing that natural inclination he had to preserve his being, he followed the will of his Maker, and therefore had a right to make use of those creatures which by his reason or senses he could discover would be serviceable thereunto. And thus man's property in the creatures was founded upon the right he had to make use of those things that were necessary or useful to his being.
Next, Locke explores the second strand of Filmer's argument. All legitimate political power, Filmer asserts, derives from a father's divinely ordained power over his children.
All power on earth is either derived or usurped from the fatherly power, there being no other original to be found of any power whatsoever. Even the power which God himself exerciseth over mankind is by right of fatherhood. He is both the king and father of us all.
According to Filmer, the power of a father, like that of a monarch, is absolute. A father has the absolute power of life and death over his children. Filmer, Locke charges, merely asserts this proposition without argument or proof.
He that should demand of Sir Robert Filmer how, or for what reason it is, that begetting a child gives the father such an absolute power over him, we'll find him answer nothing. We are to take his word for this, as well as several other things, and by that the laws of nature and the constitutions of government must stand or fall.
Although Filmer does not offer reasons for the father's absolute power, Locke acknowledges that other writers had attempted to argue the point.
The argument I have heard others make use of to prove that fathers, by begetting them, come by an absolute power over their children is this, that fathers have a power over the lives of their children because they give them life and being.
Here, Locke alludes to a theological controversy with roots deep in Christian history. According to a theory known as Traducianism, from the Latin word meaning shoot or sprout, the human soul is transmitted by the parents to the children. Various theologians had defended Traducianism as a way to explain the transmission of original sin from one generation to the next. Another theory, known as creationism, maintains that God creates a new soul for each human individual at its conception or birth. This is the general position which Locke adopts.
They who say the father gives life to his children are so dazzled with the thoughts of monarchy that they do not, as they ought, remember God, who is the author and giver of life. 'Tis in him alone we live, move, and have our being.
Locke denies that parents create their children in any meaningful sense. We know precious little about the structure and functions of the human body, and it is absurd to believe that by becoming parents we somehow fashion or create a human being. No, says Locke, God is the creator, and to God alone belongs the absolute power which Filmer attributes to the father. And even if we were to concede that parents create their children and so acquire dominion over them, then clearly this power would belong not to the father alone, but to the father and mother jointly. Filmer, like many of his predecessors, cites the Fifth Commandment in his defense of paternal authority. But the Fifth Commandment says, "Honor thy father and thy mother." So, as Locke points out, any conclusions drawn from this commandment must apply to the mother as well.
We may conclude that the honor parents have a title to from their children is one common right, belonging so equally to them both that neither can claim it wholly, neither can be excluded.
Do parents possess the power of life and death over their children? This question may strike the modern reader as bizarre, but it was central to the debate over patriarchalism. For consider, an essential characteristic of sovereign government is the legitimate power to pass laws, which, in the final analysis, may be enforced by killing those who disobey. Therefore, if the case for patriarchalism was to succeed, Filmer had to show how the father's power, the origin of political power, contains within it the power of life and death. This absolute paternal power was insisted on by Jean Bodin, a late 16th century French philosopher who greatly influenced Filmer. Bodin pointed to ancient customs and legal codes which had bestowed absolute power upon parents.
In any rightly ordered commonwealth, that power of life and death over their children, which belongs to them under the law of God and of nature, should be restored to parents. This most primitive of customs was observed in ancient times by the Persians, and people of Asia generally, by the Romans and the Celts. It was also recognized throughout the New World till the time of the Spanish conquest.
Filmer, following Bodin, also recalls these ancient customs.
We find the sale and gift of children to have been much in use in the beginning of the world, when men had their servants for a possession and an inheritance as well as other goods. We find the power of castrating and making eunuchs, much in use in old times.
Locke is horrified by this appeal to ancient customs. Surely, he argues, reason has emancipated us from past barbarisms.
Thus, far can the busy mind of man carry him to a brutality below the level of beasts, when he quits his reason which places him almost equal to angels. Nor can it be otherwise in a creature whose thoughts are more than the sands, and wider than the ocean, where fancy and passion must needs run him into strange courses, if reason, which is his only star and compass, be not that he steers by.
As Locke sees it, the power of parents and the power of government are fundamentally different. And in the second treatise, Locke spends an entire chapter spelling out these differences. Children are subject to parental power because their reasoning faculties are not fully developed.
The power that parents have over their children arises from that duty which is incumbent on them to take care of their offspring during the imperfect state of childhood, to inform the mind and govern the actions of their yet ignorant nonage, till reason shall take its place and ease them of that trouble, is what the children want, and the parents are bound to. For God, having given man an understanding to direct his actions, has allowed him a freedom of will and liberty of acting, as properly belonging thereunto, within the bounds of that law he is under. But whilst he is in an estate wherein he has no understanding of his own to direct his will, he is not to have any will of his own to follow. He that understands for him must will for him too. He must prescribe to his will and regulate his actions. But when he comes to the estate that made his father a freeman, the son is a freeman too.
When children attain the age of reason, they grow out of parental subjection and acquire the right to act on their own judgment. This, Locke says, is what it means to say man is born free.
We are born free as we are born rational, not that we actually have the exercise of either. Age that brings one brings with it the other too.
Having disposed of Robert Filmer in the first treatise, John Locke proceeds in the second treatise to present his own political philosophy. Before examining this famous second treatise, however, we should pause to consider an essential element of Locke's political philosophy, the idea of the law of nature, or natural law. The idea of a natural moral law has existed as long as ethical theory has existed, and it was exceedingly popular among 17th century moral philosophers. Basically, natural law refers to an objective moral standard transcending human will and convention, a standard somehow rooted in the nature of things, a standard to which human beings and their institutions should conform. This approach is found in the ancient Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, as well as in the Roman school of philosophy known as Stoicism. John Locke refers to natural law many times in his second treatise. Indeed, natural law is the cornerstone of his political philosophy. With this belief in objective, knowable moral principles, Locke defends moral theory as a science capable of incontrovertible proof. As Locke says in his famous philosophical work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding,
the idea of a supreme being, infinite in power, goodness, and wisdom, whose workmanship we are, and on whom we depend, and the idea of ourselves as understanding, rational creatures, being such as are clear in us, would, I suppose, if duly considered and pursued, afford such foundation of our duty and rules of action as might place morality amongst the sciences capable of demonstration, wherein I doubt not, but from self-evident propositions, by necessary consequences as incontestable as those in mathematics, the measures of right and wrong might be made out to any one that will apply himself with the same indifferency and attention to the one as he does to the other of these sciences.
Two features of natural law emerge from this passage. Natural laws are part of divine law, and natural laws are knowable to human reason. These beliefs place Locke in a venerable tradition, dating back to the great 13th century Catholic philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Natural law, according to Aquinas, is that part of God's law which is knowable to human reason. Locke discusses natural law in 2 essays written during his early years at Christ Church, Oxford. In these essays, which remained unpublished for 300 years, Locke says natural law carries the sanction of God's will, but natural law is not morally binding solely because God wills it. Like other Christian philosophers in his tradition, Locke says God could have created the world differently than he did, and in that case a different moral law may have prevailed. But given the world and man as God created them, a natural moral law flows necessarily from the nature of things.
For though the will and power of God have an absolute and infinite command upon the existences of all created things, to make them be or not to be at pleasure, yet when things exist, they are what they are, this or that, absolutely or relatively, not by will or arbitrary command, but by the necessity of their own nature.
This is the end of Tape 1 on 2 Treatises of Government. The presentation is continued on Tape 2.